of a recent wintry illustration that I created. Like many of you, I find backgrounds quite challenging and I tend to focus more on the characters rather than the background. So for this piece, I decided to keep the background quite simple and use the basic principles for creating backgrounds, which is to have a foreground and a midground, and this is where I placed my characters, and then the background itself. So I thought I'd share how I tackled the painting of the sky, as it's not something I often do in my work. So I found this technique to be fairly stress-free. So I thought I'd share it with you as well. Okay, so the brushes I'll be using today are mainly from the Messy Paintbox. And it's generally the messy and smudgy that I'll be using, and then I do use a lot of blending, and for this particular illustration I decided to use the blenders from my AquaReal 2, but quite honestly I think you could use pretty much any blender that has a little bit of a messy sort of edge to it. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but I find using like a gloopy, if I just come back to the Messy Paintbox, using kind of like a gloopy paintbrush is really helpful for this particular technique. So the first thing I want to do is just run through my layers that I use and the layer structure that I have. Essentially, this is what we're aiming for. So I'm going to show you how I tackled that particular part of my illustration. And as I mentioned, I find, I'm just going to turn that off. Oh, I just wanted to mention as well, the paper and effects that I'm using is actually from AquaReal 2. I often combine my brush sets and canvases together. For example, I use the Messy Paintbox with the watercolor canvas for this particular piece. Okay, having a look at the layer structure. So we have our paper and effects layer right at the top. This is just the swatches that I use for this particular piece. And the reason why I've placed them above the paper texture, I want the true color. So that's why I don't want the paper texture to affect any of the actual colors. And that's why I place it above. So this is my, you'll see this is my character layer, and if I just turn all of those off, essentially this, I feel confident doing characters. I find it much easier just to do the characters and not think about the background. So what I did in this particular piece, I actually started with the characters, which I know is not the right way to do it, but I wanted to emphasize you know, the fact that you don't always have to follow what the right way is. Follow what is the easiest way for you. It'll be less stressful. So what I did here was I tackled my characters first, and then I tackled my background. But I did, you'll see my shadow layer is included in this. So the shadow layer I did right at the end. But essentially I did my characters first, and then I thought about my background. So what I did was, I'm just going to get rid of that. I did a very rough sketch, which unfortunately I don't have here, so I can't show you that. But I did a very rough sketch of a background idea. And as mentioned, I just kept it simple, which is having a kind of foreground elements you'll see in the front. And then my midground was where the characters are. And then the background, I just, you know, drew a couple of trees and knew I wanted some sky, just to set a scene. So I didn't want the scene itself to be the focus. I obviously wanted the characters to be a focus. So if you are stuck with dealing with backgrounds, just think about those three principles. So your foreground, your midground, and your background. And honestly, all you have to do is just keep it simple, just to kind of create a scene. It doesn't have to be too complicated. Okay, coming back to our character layer, and then this is the midground. So I used the same technique that I'm going to show you now for the sky. I used on the midground as well. So I'm hoping that this is going to help you and see that you can apply color really quickly without too much fuss. Yeah, so I found this technique to be really helpful. So just to show you, that's what we're aiming for. And I'm just going to turn that off. So now I'm going to turn on my swatches. And on a new layer, I'm going to start adding color. I'm going to essentially apply one color first, and this can be any old brush really, so I'm just going to use one of the large brushes, and I'm going to choose a greenish color, and I'm just laying the foundation first. I'm not really thinking about, I'm just swapping the brush. So I want a more sort of textured brush. So I'm not really thinking too much about the line work or the stroke quality at this stage. I'm just applying color. But I am stroking it, if that makes sense, applying a lot of strokes. And the reason why I'm doing that, because this brush has variation every time it applies color, every, new stroke. And now the idea with this technique is to build it up, and that's what we're kind of aiming for. So I'm going to start with like a darker color initially. So we're going to go dark to light. And now coming over to my messy smudger, I'm just here and there, that is my dark color, here and there going to apply, and you see how I'm constantly picking up my pencil because I want those smudgy sort of rough edges. The trees we're going to tackle after we've done our background, so I don't want to be restricted to working around the trees. And what I like to do is just vary the tone here and there as I'm working. And now I'm just going a dash lighter. And you'll see I'm quite messy. I'm not thinking too much about, being neat. I'm just aiming for that really sort of textured look. And now I'm going to do some smudging. So to be honest with you, there isn't really a fixed rule. It's more about instinct. I'm just going to change my smudger. So I'm going to use the spidery water from AquaReal too, but as I mentioned, you actually can use any smudger that has a little bit of, texture to it. So this really, as I was saying, is instinctive. You can decide where you want to apply the smudging. But you'll see we're starting to get quite a nice painterly effect. I might just tone that down a bit. So now I'm working towards the lighter part. So here and there, I'm just going to add some light tones and more of a blue color. And I'm just selecting my color, different tints here and there. So you might want to think about selecting your palette ahead of the time. And now I'm just gonna smudge that in a bit, but I'm keeping some of that really nice texture. You'll see this, it really is like, how do I say, kind of a messy technique, and it's quite freeing. I'm really lifting my pencil a lot and kind of smudging as I go. So you can decide how much, of a difference or contrast in color that you want in tone. But I am focusing on still keeping quite a bit of that original green color that we applied, which is, you'd think, may not go for a sky, but I wanted to marry nicely with my original sketch that I did. So this might take you a little bit of getting used to and experimenting. You might even need to give it a few goes until you find the results that you're happy with. But you can see the idea is to build up your color. it's quite a therapeutic technique, really. And I'm gonna go quite light. So I aim for like building from the bottom darker to lighter. And of course your personal preference to how textured you want it. But that kind of gives you an idea of how you can tackle something quite difficult. Well, I find backgrounds quite difficult. So now I'm going to just move on to the trees. And the trees, I want quite a light blue. You can decide to use a separate layer for this. And again, fairly messy with my line work, or stroke, should I say. I'm thinking about retaining that painterly look, because I find that when you apply these kinds of painterly textures, you can get away with so much. In other words, not having to have too much detail in your artwork. It's more about the suggestion of the shape when we use this technique. And what you're doing is you're giving the audience more of a painterly effect rather than realistic. And you'll see I'm leaving quite a lot of the underneath shining through, which I really like. I like that look. And what I want to do is just fix this. Looks a little messy there. Too messy. I hope you can hear how often I'm lifting my pencil, if that's helpful. Because this particular brush changes in tone slightly, and also yeah, you can see the texture that is formed every time, kind of like a smudgy painterly edge. So that is what I'm aiming for. Coming together, I think. And then finally what I want to do is just add white, making sure that it's white. So these are my little snow accents. In fact, I might choose a slightly cream color. Let's see what that looks like. I might start as my base color and then work back to white. So it's all about layering with this specific technique. Oops, too big. And you'll see I've only just used one brush. We don't have to get complicated. Going back to white. I'm going to try a different brush. Oops. And see if that gives me... No, I still prefer that. let's have a look at what we've got. And turning everything else on. I think that looks pretty good. So obviously these trees that you see in the background I had already done on a separate layer, just to show you. And those trees I added afterwards just to darken those areas and give it a bit more complexity. So you can decide how much of depth you want to, because those trees essentially are creating that depth. So you can also add that into your work. So I hope that technique was helpful to you, and I hope it's going to help you take the stress out of adding color to larger areas in backgrounds. Thanks for watching and happy creating!